Next up, I give you Genius. I have to say that because she's a founder of Stokescroft Writers. I have to say that because she gives a nasty Chinese burn. I have to say that because she has an imagination that reflects a deeply psychopathic nature. And I have to say that because I have to report she is a genius. Please welcome Christie Cluett with Living in a Fishbowl.
Hello. I understand the set list of making a vegan go after that. This is Living in a Fishbowl. Janet was looking for the exact colour of ornament to go with the new curtains, bottle green. Maybe a bottle, she thought, as she perused the stalls of Jeff and Linda's garage sale. She picked up knickknacks, trinkets, baubles and trifles, trying to work out what visitors would think of each one. She eyed her husband, Martin, as he bartered a little too enthusiastically with Linda over a record player that definitely wasn't coming in her house. Janet turned the teal figurine in her hands, wondering if it was heavy enough to accidentally cleave Martin's skull in, or was just light enough to stop him from laughing in that way. She measured the weight in her hand and then put it back on the table. "Darling," Janet said, taking hold of Martin's elbow with her fingernails digging in. He flinched slightly, but didn't let his smile slip for more than a millimetre. "Seen anything?" She didn't wait for an answer, smiling at Linda. "I love all your things, Linda. Such lovely things. I can't imagine why you're getting rid of them." "I know, Janet," Linda said, laughing slightly wildly. Janet laughed too, not entirely sure what they were laughing at, but not wanting to ask in case it was obvious. Soon, Martin joined in, and the three of them were laughing at nothing as Jeff finished taking 20p for a Dan Brown hardback. Jeff then nodded and laughed along with them, at God knows what. "Seen anything, Martin?" Jeff called. Martin smiled, nodded, and laughed. "I know, Jeff," Martin said. "I know." Janet laughed while she nodded, and Linda joined in. And then the four of them continued to laugh as they tried not to look at each other. As Janet chuckled to a slow halt, she was met with the beginnings of a silence that loomed towards her. She could see it threatening Martin as he turned his slightly desperate gaze towards her. Janet blinked, looked around her, grabbing the first object she saw as the laughing stopped. "Oh, how lovely! This is lovely, isn't it, Martin?" she said at the obviously non-green thing in her hands. "It certainly is," Martin agreed. "Oh, yes, it really is," Linda said, taking the clear round fishbowl from Janet's hand as Jeff nodded and smiled his agreement as he backed slowly towards the garage. £2 to you, Janet," Linda said, as Janet put her hand in her pocket and thrust the bowl in Martin's hands. "Oh, I'm so pleased we found just the thing." "Lovely," Janet said. "Lovely," they all said in unison as they backed away from each other with wide smiles. Martin put the fishbowl on the side table with a clunk. "Well, that was nice." Janet sighed as she listened to Martin click on the kettle, humming to himself loudly, a half-tune that she'd been listening to for 22 years. She picked up the bowl, turning it in her hands, measuring the weight, and wondering if it would split his scalp or was just light enough to stop him humming for a little while. She put it back on the table, switching it from left to right. As she pushed it back to the centre, she leaned in to flick out a couple of grains of sand left in the bottom, before she went upstairs to lie down under a cold flannel. The next morning, Janet was waiting for the kettle to boil, watching Martin standing in the garden, looking over the fence at nothing, as was his habit. She looked at the new fishbowl, wondering where Janet had kept it in her house, as she noticed a small patch of sand in the bottom of the bowl. She leaned closer. It hadn't been there yesterday, an obvious increase on the couple of grains that she'd cleaned out. She picked it up and emptied it into the sink before turning her attention to the boiling kettle. After lunch, after slowly wiping the counter, Janet picked up the bowl and found an inch of sand completely covering the bottom. She opened the back door to shout for Martin, who turned with a faraway look in his eyes that he struggled to focus. "Look," she said, thrusting the bowl in his hand, "there's sand in it." Martin nodded and shrugged as he took it for her and went towards the sink. "No," she said, "I've already tried that." "Is the tea ready?" he said, eyeing the cold-looking cups on the side, but Janet wasn't listening. She was staring at the sand, trying to see if it was getting any bigger, as Martin edged around her and clicked on the kettle. From that day onwards, the fishbowl didn't disappoint Janet's curiosity. The next day, the island of sand had shrunk slightly, but by the evening, a ring of water had formed around the outside. Next, a tiny palm tree sprung up in the middle of the island, and then another, finally joined together by a hammock strung between them. Janet peered inside the bowls for hours as the days passed in heavy silence. Martin only nodded and smiled vaguely until the day they came downstairs, and there was a perfectly formed, small deluxe beach house resting on the island. "Oh," Martin said, inspecting the overlapping white tiles of the roof, the painted boards of the outside walls. "That guttering needs seeing to." As they watched, the sand indented slightly along the curve of the shore, and the water began lapping gently until it turned into tiny cresting waves. A seagull popped into existence in the middle of the bowl and swooping over the whole scene. Martin's humming was jolted into a surprised silence as a speck of blue was just discernible sweeping round the edge of the bowl. They watched as it zoomed past them, getting bigger and bigger as it raced towards the edge of the sand, finally recognisable as a small car, a convertible. Its wheels gripped the sand as it took off at quite a rate across the sand towards the house. As it careered along the makeshift road, Janet could see a striped umbrella angled out of the back seat, and she caught the high pitch of a woman's laughter as it was spun up by the wind. They leaned closer and could see in the front seat a man in sunglasses, with one hand on the wheel, his arm across the back seat behind the blonde girl next to him. Martin and Janet watched as the tiny car screeched to a halt and the figures leapt out. The girl was wearing figure-hugging red capris and a white shirt tied at the front, revealing a flat, tan stomach. It reminded Janet of what she used to wear in her younger, firmer days. The small man in the bowl ran a palm back through his hair to smooth it down and smiled off into the distance. Martin absently touched the bald spot at the back of his head as the man turned with a grin, hauled the woman over his shoulder, running into the sound of her delighted giggles. Over the following weeks, the activity in the fishbowl fascinated Janet. She pulled a chair from the dining room as soon as she got home from work, watching the tiny, good-looking pair as they sunbathed, as they went for walks hand in hand, as they played volleyball on the sand. She ate her dinner from a plate that she hardly noticed Martin set beside her, sitting with a forkful of mashed potato poised in mid-air until it was cold with a crust. "We should go on a beach holiday, don't you think, Martin? Martin?" Martin was waiting for the kettle to boil, staring out the window at something far in the distance, humming to himself. Janet watched the man in the bowl haul a record player outside. Music Janet remembered from her youth blared out, and she wondered if Linda and Jeff danced to their old records. "Maybe we should learn to dance," she said to Martin's back. She watched the figures sadly as their tiny waists twisted round each other in the sand, not noticing that Martin had stopped humming. "We should start having sex in the daytime, Martin, don't you think, Martin?" Janet jumped slightly as Martin's fist pounded into the kitchen counter, apparently a final straw. "No," he said, with his head down. "No, Janet, enough. I don't want to go on a beach holiday. I don't want to start eating fresh mango. I certainly don't want to learn to surf, and there's absolutely no way we can have sex standing up. You know I have problems with my knees." Janet looked up at him as the tiny couple retreated into the beach house, closing the door quietly behind them. "I don't want the life of that man in the fishbowl, and neither should you. You know he's very different when you're not here. That's not the only girl he's brought out there to that island, willfully ignoring the highway code as he endangers everyone's life in that convertible. There are no seatbelts, Janet, no seatbelts. The last time you went to the shop, he turned up with a couple of ladies in hardly any clothing and drawn-on eyebrows. And I'm pretty sure they were mother and daughter." The windows of the beach house snapped shut as shouting from inside rustled the curtains. Janet looked from the bowl to Martin and sighed. "Mother and daughter, Janet. You want me to be like him? all sunglasses and filling out his trousers. Janet raised her eyebrows, about to let out a squeak of, well, before Martin continued, his voice loud and slightly too high. You want me to fuck your mother, Janet? Do you? Because I will, if that's what you want. The door to the beach house was ripped open, and the woman in her beach shorts and crop top came storming out with a suitcase. She took off across the sand, the heavy case bumping against her legs, as the little man in the bowl watched her go, smoking a cigarette with a smirk on his face. Martin's voice was lower. I will, if that's what you want, Janet, because I love you. Oh, Martin, Janet said, looking away from the bowl. She patted his cheek as she passed on the way to the kitchen. No. Thanks, but no. I doubt she'd be into it anyway. Her and Dennis from across the way are experimenting with BDSM. Martin nodded, looking relieved. He heard Janet pick up the kettle and sat down to wait for the tea. He didn't hear the click, though, and was surprised when Janet came marching back with the full kettle. She had a determined look in her eye that he'd seen during Christmas supermarket trips, as she slowly poured the water into the fishbowl. They both watched the gradual rise of the tide mark as the edges of the island began to disappear. The little man came out of the house and looked up in panic at his sky, straight at Janet, shaking his tiny fist in anger. Martin looked away, humming a jaunty little tune to himself and wondering what was for dinner. But Janet watched as the little man ran to his car, swearing and cursing. She watched him drive away with a sad look on her face. He'd almost got to the edge of the island. He'd almost got away, when Janet upended the kettle and flooded the whole place. She turned away and gave Martin a wide smile. There, she said, not looking back, as a small blue car floated within the water, a tiny hand fluttering against the window. That's done. Martin nodded vaguely. Come on, Martin, she said, holding out her hands. I'll let you watch me do the washing up. Martin got up with a sigh, wondering whether he was going to be murdered with that fishbowl. It was definitely heavy enough to cave his head in. Definitely not just light enough to cause the coma he'd been dreaming of. He stood in the kitchen, watching Janet do the washing up, and wondered what Jeff and Linda did on a Saturday night.